Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's session, Strengthening Your Organizational Anti-Racist Practice. We're really glad you're here today. This is a 90-minute session as a reminder. My name is Jean Bell, and I curate our management and leadership online sessions at Nonprofit Quarterly. For some of you, I know you're a return person, and we're glad to see you again. Some of you may be Nonprofit Quarterly members. Others, this may be your first time, and welcome. This is such an important topic, and we're thrilled to have Pavi Tamu and Crystal Torres Covarrubias with us today. Let me give you a couple of logistical pieces before I hand it off to them. This session is being recorded, so if you registered for it, you will get a recording with the slides probably early next week. We will be using a couple of different interactive tools that the presenters will share with you in a moment. The chat is not one of them though, so don't need to use the chat, and so you'll get more guidance from our presenters about how to interact during the session in a few moments. We always have a pop-up evaluation at the end, so please don't click off until the end. And then when you do, there'll be a brief evaluation that allows us to give feedback to the presenters and also get your guidance about future sessions that are important to you. So please complete that evaluation. So let me now introduce our presenters. Pavi Tamu Bryant is the co-creator of an organization called Freedom Versus, where they are leadership, diversity, and equity consultant. They've spent time honing their facilitation, mediation skills, and analysis through working with an array of organizations, from facilitating strategic vision processes to designing leadership development programs for marginalized communities. They've worked with a diverse set of needs and struggled with leaders to best address them. Welcome, Pavi Tamu. And Crystal Torres Covarrubias is an advocate, facilitator, and learning designer. Her background is grounded in community building, political education, and educational justice. Over the course of her career, she's partnered with school districts, nonprofit organizations, government agencies, and more in service of advancing more just, equitable, and liberated communities. She's skilled at forming group process, designing dynamic people-centered experiences, and advancing systems change. And we're really appreciative that you've worked together to design this session for us today and really look forward to it. I hand it off to you now, and I'll come back towards the end and facilitate some Q&A.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody who's joining us, Nonprofit Quarterly, for having us. I'm not going to say too much about myself anymore, other than my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I'm going to give it to Pavi Tamu to ask if they have anything to share.
I will also just share pronouns. Thank you for the warm welcome and intro, Jean. And I use the pronouns they and them, and I'm excited to be in conversation with folks today.
So we're going to get started on strengthening your organizational anti-racist practice. Before we do, we want to share a couple of things around the flow of this workshop, expectations. In the kind of description of this workshop, you'll see that our session is really grounded in building awareness around personal and institutional privilege. We'll be focusing and using both lenses throughout the workshop or the webinar. We're going to be talking about access to resources and proximity to power. We're defining what courageous anti-racist education could look like for your organization that is informed by community needs in different ways. And we're working to identify the necessary risk-taking opportunities.
It looks like we might have had a freeze there.
Sure does. I'm going to jump in.
Okay. Thanks.
Until Crystal's able to get unfroze. So we're also going to be definitely identifying the necessary risk-taking opportunities that are available both for you as an individual, right? And thinking about the internal and interpersonal dynamics, but also really looking at how our institutions are able to create equitable spaces to transform the world that we live in and the spaces that we're holding. So that's what we're going to be jumping into today. We want to be able to spend some time engaging with folks around using a tool called Mentimeter, and Crystal is the lead on that. So I'm gonna acknowledge that when Crystal is able to kind of jump back in with us, we'll pause and take a moment to do some checking in with folks that way. So let me move us into some conversation. So when we think about what it means to be anti-racist, there are a lot of different ways that folks are in conversation about this right now. And I really want to make sure that there's clarity for us when we're talking about what it means to be an organization and have an institution that's committed to being anti-racist. What does that look like for us? So we want to make sure that people are clear and have an opportunity to get some ideas about where your organization might be on its journey towards becoming an anti-racist organization. And so I want to take a little bit of time to talk about a continuum of anti-racist, continuum towards being an anti-racist organization. There are 6 kind of spaces where folks might live, and I want to acknowledge that in those spaces where folks might live, there are different ways that your organization might be like a little in one area and a little in another. Crystal, I'm just going to do a live check-in just to see what you think makes sense. I'm moving into the continuum, and I think it could be helpful for us to know a little bit about who's in the room. If you want us to pause here and do the Mentimeter check.
Oh, I would love that. I am so sorry. My internet hasn't gone out for months and it just decided to go off. So here we are.
Timing.
I imagine what that would be like in person, if we were in person and I was presenting, I would just get swept away. Anyways, let's get going with this Mentimeter. Pavitami, did you do the description of what the tool is? No. Okay. So throughout the session, we'll be using a tool called Mentimeter, which some of you might have used. This was around when folks were in person as well. The way that it works is that you can either use your phone or your device on the side and through a different window. We're going to ask you to go to menti.com. When you enter menti.com, it'll ask you for a code, and this is the code you're going to put in. Thanks for doing that. I'm going to take over screen share, Pavitami, so if we can get a live read of what's going on for folks. So we can all see who's in the room. Does that look good? Can you see that? Cool. As you can see, we're moving, we're forming as we get input. We have some white folks, some female folks, queer folks, mother, woman as important identities, executive directors in the room. Fantastic. Whew, here we go. I love it. Advocate. Managing director. CEO. These are ones that I'm seeing come to the center. But as you can see, we have this growing diversity of folks in this room, and we're getting a lot of folks centering in female, white, woman, executive director, board member. We have a good number of board members in the room, a good number of advocates. Fantastic.
Great. So thank you so much. It's really helpful for us to have an idea of who is in the conversation with us. We want to make sure that as we are thinking about who we're engaging with, we're present with who we're talking with and to, and hopefully our examples and the way we're talking through things are salient for folks. So I started talking a little bit about the continuum towards being an anti-racist organization, and identify that there are kind of 6 ways that folks 6 places that folks may find their organizations landing on this continuum. And I want to acknowledge that you may be a little bit in different places as an organization. But as we talk through this, I just want folks to be listening and kind of starting to think about, where am I? Where's my organization? How do I see my organization showing up here in this continuum? So we're going to zoom in on each. So first, the first place that we think about on the continuum is an exclusionary organization. And so this is an organization that is openly maintaining a white dominant group, right? So they're centering white folks. White folks are the main folks who are present in the conversations. Might even be the case that it's white men or things like that, right? Like a group with the most power in society is the group whose voice, attitude, culture, norms are being centered in the space. There is overt and explicit exclusion and discrimination. Harassment can be experienced by folks who are not of that identity, and folks are maybe also experiencing hostility. These environments are often unsafe for BIPOC folks and folks who are marginalized along other identities as well, right? So when we think of an exclusionary organization, exclusionary place, we might be thinking of it would look like this, right? An organization that has a culture that looks like this. The next one I want to talk a little bit about is the club. And so in the club, when your institution is here on the spectrum, really like white folks are the dominant group who is maintaining kind of traditionally held power and influence. So thinking about white folks are in leadership and decision-making positions. White folks are the folks who most inform decision-making that is happening at the organization. So thinking about, if we thinking about our institutions, are the funders who we're in conversation with most often white folks, are the board members of our organization most often white folks, thinking kind of along those lines, right? So not just who is in the decision-making roles, but who's also influencing how decision-making is happening at the organization. White dominant culture and policies and procedures are viewed as the right way of doing things, right? So I think it's important. I love this little comic because it really kind of illustrates this point for me. And I think about children a lot when I think about this, right? When we're teaching our kids, when we're helping them to like get accustomed to things, a lot of times we start to see our own norms and those types of things and the ways that we think about what's the right way, what's the normal way, what's the appropriate way. And so I'm just going to share a short anecdote here. I have a 3-year-old who about 6 months ago started saying, we try to use about 4 different languages in my family, trying to kind of have a wider spectrum of conversation. And so my kids exposed to Japanese, Spanish, English, and American Sign Language. And about 6 months ago, my kids started saying, I want you to talk regular. Please speak regular. And I was like, what does that mean? What are you saying when you say speak regular? And so we had to have several conversations about it. And what had been normalized for my child is English. That to them was regular. And so when I would speak Spanish or try and practice ASL with them, I would get this response of, please speak regular. Can you speak regular? And so we had to have some moments of like processing that. What does that mean that English has become the language that's normalized, right? So just as an example of like the types of ways that we are thinking about what's right or what's normal, what's regular, right? And we'll talk about interventions in a while, and I'll get back to the story about my child when we get there. This is also in kind of the club space, there's a limited number of folks who are BIPOC who are allowed in, and only when they have the right credentials, attitudes, or behaviors. So really when they are, if and only when they are assimilating to white cultural norms, right? So thinking about the club as that. And I'm gonna pass the baton to Crystal to take us through the next 2.
Yeah, thank you. So we're now looking at a compliance organization. So in a compliance organization, there's still a white dominant group and culture. There's still what is normal, what is regular, right? And some BIPOC folks might be allowed into the organization or might be hired into the organization, but it doesn't change the org itself, right? So this might be perhaps there's white folks in those key decision-making places that Pavi Tammy described earlier, and there are BIPOC folks who are managing programs, directing programs, program coordinators in these places where they might be in positions to do some of the work. However, it might not have the places, the positions that allow them to change structures, systems, have decision-making power. BIPOC must assimilate to the org culture, meaning that if they are in those positions, there are channels that they are appropriate to get that stuff done, right? So BIPOC might be thinking that might look like having a BIPOC leader. So BIPOC, I don't know if we said this already, but is Black, Indigenous, People of Color. That's the abbreviation. So someone who identifies as such, you know, in order to get funding for their idea or approval of their idea, they're presenting to the board in a very specific way, right? So they, with these very specific metrics, the way that it's always been done. So they're there and they're following procedure. They're doing what it takes to be compliant with the organizational culture and what's normal. These organizations might have a race neutral approach. So that means, you know, we don't think about color at all. Everybody who is qualified enters, right? Or everyone who is qualified is considered in these different ways. Not recognizing that a race neutral approach is normalizing marginalization and minimizing the fact that there is difference and that BIPOC folks do have different sets of experiences that need to be taken into account. So that is a compliance organization, someone who is kind of going through some of the work in sense of saying, we do enough, right? We do enough. Next, now we're looking at an affirming organization. An affirming organization is not a bad organization. They've shared commitment to eliminating discrimination, maybe broadly, maybe haven't necessarily said the words racism for a while or ableism or any specific oppressions, but have decided that they are definitely committed to ending discrimination. There are statements perhaps that go out occasionally, depending on the time. Some cultural differences are acknowledged. So there might be heritage months, there might be employee groups, right? They're acknowledged and celebrated. However, there might be others that are completely overlooked. So even in the case of there being heritage group and employee groups, you might always have Christmas break, not recognizing that Christmas is not necessarily something that would be acknowledged by everybody, right? Or that is that invites everybody's diverse celebrations. So recognizing that there's still this underlying dominant culture, and although other folks are here and are celebrated, they're not necessarily breaking into these strong foundational cultures. There's an active effort to recruit and hire and support BIPOC folks. So that could be mentorship programs, that could be specific recruitment strategies, maybe from certain colleges, things like that. Staff receive diversity trainings, maybe that are not informed by staff need or by specific BIPOC in the organization, but are kind of standard diversity trainings. And still BIPOC are asked to assimilate to white dominant culture. Again, in positions, they're there, not necessarily shifting foundational culture.
Thanks, Crystal. I'm going to circle back just because we had a question about unpacking the difference between the club and the compliance, and I just want to make sure that feels clear for folks. So yes, one of the big distinguishers between club and compliance is access of Black, Indigenous, and people of color to the institution or space, right? So you will see more Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the organization when it's a compliance organization compared to when it's a club organization. And I just want to elevate as a distinction the club space is also continues to normalize whiteness in a hyper way, if I can say it that way, right? So if you think about who's visible, what's valued, those types of things, that will feel more alive in a club organization around whiteness. Then you'll feel that moving a little further along in the compliance space. So I'm going to continue. We want to get to an organization that's in the process of redefining. And so this is an organization that has shifted to be much more intentional about its process for hiring, recruiting, retaining, and developing BIPOC at all levels in the organization. So thinking about Black and Indigenous people from entry level positions in the organization to leadership positions within the organization, and really being thoughtful about what our needs. And some of that thoughtfulness may look like not just doing things like exit interviews, but actually taking the learnings from those exit interviews, especially from folks who have left the organization who are BIPOC people, to see what do we need to shift? What are some of the themes that have come up? That sort of thing. That's what we mean when we're talking about intentionality. What types of investment do we need to make in professional development or in support systems, or creating peer networks, or supporting our folks to use some of their work time to engage in peer networks, right? That sort of intentionality is what we're talking about. And really, in the redefining space, an organization is starting to use a race equity lens to manage the entire organization. So thinking about how from our internal practices, our structures, our systems, and our culture, are we thinking about racial equity? How is racial equity alive in our organization? To thinking about in our programming, how is racial equity a priority and alive in our organization? So really using that lens and having that lens become a key way that we're assessing and learning as our organizations are growing and developing. In the redefining space, an organization is also creating spaces in an ongoing way for conversation on race. So it's not a one-time moment like we talked about in the affirming, where it's like we might do annual diversity trainings, right? No, we've created spaces for race conversations around race, experience of marginalization, to happen in ongoing ways. This might mean if you have one-on-one check-ins, you dedicate at least one a month of your check-ins with folks to talk about how are things moving, how are things feeling, how are things looking, how is our racial equity lens being applied well or not, based on what you're experiencing, right? And then we want to highlight that in this place, also an organization is really focusing on engaging and empowering all staff to think about how are we redesigning our policies, our practices, our services, and our programs, right? So we'll close out with an equitable organization. So this is an organization that really is reflecting, right? So what we see from the organization, what folks are experiencing, so internally and externally, are the contributions and centering the contributions and interests of BIPOC folks, and really the organization is active and is acting on its commitment to racial equity and inclusion, again, both internally and externally. The organization has acknowledged and continues to acknowledge institutional and systemic factors that are contributing to people's experiences of racial marginalization and oppression, and experiences of racialized privilege, right? And is actively doing work to promote equity and inclusion in the organization. So this looks like really understanding with our vendors, with our partners, amongst our staff and on our team, what are the ways that our organization itself has institutionalized things that have contributed to people's experiences of marginalization and supported people's experiences of privilege, and what are we doing to undo that and to map out a different practice, a different procedure, or a different policy, right? In organizations that are equitable, it is the norm, it is expected that you will see BIPOC folks in leadership positions and are as decision makers. So there's a commitment to that. It's visible in the organization. These are our folks are able to lead the trajectory and set the course for the organization. And again, like we're thinking about folks who are on your management teams and those executive level positions, also thinking about decision making, what your board makeup is comprised of, those types of things. And then this is an organization where BIPOC folks also feel able to show up fully as themselves, like with agency. So I can, from things that might be that might seem like smaller everyday things, like I can feel free as a Black person to wear a natural hairstyle at the organization, and know that I'm not gonna receive comments on it. I'm not gonna be told that I'm unprofessional or that I look XYZ kind of way. And that's my expectation. That's the norm. So from like smaller things around like how I wear my hair to bigger things like talking about dynamics in our communities, and not feeling like we are going to be pathologized as racially marginalized folks in doing that. So across the spectrum, able to express themselves authentically. Okay. So we want to make sure that folks feel clear on these pieces. And we also want to give an opportunity for folks to do a little checking in. Where is your organization on the continuum? And again, you can go to menti.com and use the code 55590575, and we'll see what we're hearing from folks.
A good 2/3 now turning on 3/4, right in that affirming to redefining space. It's a good space to be in. Fantastic. Looks like we're rounding out our responses and folks can see where we're at. And I think it's, again, just important to name, folks might have had, I don't know, maybe a hard time, maybe a easy time finding where they are kind of generally on the spectrum, because there are, as Pavi Tammy shared, there are definitely places where some of this might be more clear in the organization than other places. But it is a great practice to get a good sense of, when I think of us generally, without the exceptions, as a whole, where we land. And we're trending on the affirming and redefining, with a few in compliance, club, and exclusionary. Fantastic. So I'm going to stop us here, and I'm going to again leave it open for a little for folks to keep on responding if you need to do so. And we're going to go into what are some of the practices that allow us to expand some movement here, that say, okay, here's where I am, but how do I get to where we want to be? How do I leverage who I am, my role, my position, and also perhaps identities that I hold to move us forward on the continuum as an organization. Before we do that, we're going to look at a little bit around intersectional solidarity and what kind of a lens of intersectional solidarity means as we apply it to moving forward across this continuum.
Thanks, Crystal. I do want to acknowledge maybe two questions that were popping up just for points of clarity. So one of the questions was around increasing the increase of organizations, BIPOC employees, and how you're tracking that. So one of the things you can do is in the interview process, and as folks are coming in, you can have open conversations and ask questions that invite folks to self-identify where and how it seems relevant, and kind of track in that way. So it's not an application question, if you will, right? But it's another way for you to get a sense of who's coming in your door and understanding like where folks are finding out about your organization from, right? So I just want to, I like to respond to some things as we're going. And then just for point of clarity, someone asked, when we're talking about an equitable organization, are we equating an equitable organization with being an anti-racist organization? For all intents and purposes, yes, right? Your anti-racist practices are alive and well when your organization has reached that space of being an equitable organization. Okay. So I want to just give people a lens to keep in mind as we're thinking about how and why we approach how we're approaching moving our organizations to be anti-racist organizations. So thinking about intersectional solidarity, what is that? What are we talking about? What does that mean? So intersectional solidarity allows us to understand that the ways that folks are experiencing their marginalization, people's experiences of marginalization are cross-cutting. So my experience as a Black gender non-conforming person who grew up as being identified as a girl or a young woman, who also grew up with parents who were often in places of being in transitional housing or being unhoused, and grew up with parents who had who lacked employment security. Like, those things shape my experience of Blackness, right? So all of those things are inform how I have experienced being Black, and that might so just in my family, right? Thinking about my older brother, his experience as a Black cisgender man is going to be different from my experience. And so our cross-cutting identities have informed how we experience our Blackness. And so intersectional solidarity is really encouraging folks to use that like intersectional lens to think about how we are also then building bridges, connections, partnerships, and becoming accomplices and standing in solidarity with folks. And I think the big thing that I want to lift up here is that intersectionality is really about shifting power to create more just and equitable communities. And we have to do that by taking account of like who is actually on the margins and understanding the ways that those intersecting identities have impacted people's experiences. And I will take this to our next. So now we're going to talk just a little bit about different practices of solidarity that can support you in applying this lens. And Crystal is going to get us started in talking about how we're raising our awareness.
Yeah, so raising awareness is really important and often misunderstood. So we're going to talk about the fact that raising awareness usually means at least two things. We talk about raising awareness. Often we think about, you can move it there, Pavi Tamu.
Yeah.
Both, social awareness, issue awareness, historical awareness, the amount of knowledge you have about other people's experiences, about history, about structures. So raising your awareness around the history of redlining and how it's impacted Black communities for decades, centuries. I mean, decades for redlining specifically, but with a legacy of centuries. So that's, raising my knowledge awareness, the information that I have about oppression structurally, historically. However, there's also this other level of awareness that's raising your own awareness around yourself, around who you are, particularly how you show up, right? So we can do a lot around raising awareness about my identities. I can say, I know that I am a brown person, somebody who has Mexican ancestry, who has an immigrant family. I can name all those things about myself, but can I also name the way that the narratives that I've been told because of those identities condition me to respond in the structures that I live in? Can I really get a hold of my own self-awareness, the way that I show up in the world when these issues are being issues of oppression, or when I'm just in a hard conversation, right? How do I show up, and how does that contribute to racism and oppression, to anti-Blackness? Or how do I readjust myself to use both the knowledge that I've built and the awareness that I've built around structural issues in combination and in connection with who I am and how I show up? How do I adjust both? And so some key questions that we offer as a way to examine that for yourself is how do the messages that I received in my childhood impact my perception of race? How are my attitudes as an adult combating or contributing to intersectional racism? And what resources do I have access to that others do not? These are not, again, like Q&A questions. This is not like ask the question and tomorrow I'm going to get the answer. These are questions that we offer as reflective questions to continue to come back to, because the answers unfold themselves perhaps over time. So for an example, for myself, I'll use myself as the example. I identify as a queer person, I identify as a Latinx person, a cisgender person, as a woman. The messages that I received in my childhood that have impacted my experience of race and class in some ways are that you have to work really hard to succeed, right? We're coming to this country and all the opportunities are there to succeed, and they're available to you if you put in enough work, if you work hard enough, sweat equity, come in and put in all the work and you can make it. And people are poor because they didn't do that, right? People are in different conditions because they haven't worked hard enough. They haven't showed up. And coupled with this narrative and notion that I have something to prove, that this is still a white country, this is still a white world. And as a brown person with this identity, there is something to prove, not only for myself, but for my people, my family, my community, as a representative. So as a child, it's kind of these narratives all the time around, you have something to prove. It's a bootstraps mentality along with like a trailblazer representative responsibility. So that's the narrative. That's what informs my understanding of myself and therefore my understanding of other people, other racialized people, and other oppressed people. That's not too bad for me because as an adult, those narratives drove me personally, and this is not true of everybody else who's received these narratives, it's drove me personally to pursue higher education. I have an Ivy League education, I have a master's degree, I have the good fortune of being employable in a lot of contexts throughout my life. And what that could do as a result is in my attitudes about how, as an adult, of how I contribute to racism, is I could continue to think that, well, because I made it, other folks of color, other folks who are oppressed, who are marginalized, who have similar or different marginalized identities than me, should also be able to make it, right? That there's nothing stopping them except for themselves. And this can become intersectional, in the sense of, I think, intersectional oppression. We say intersectional solidarity building, but also oppression when I start to look at other folks who, again, who I think have less challenges than me. For example, my brother, who I'm like, well, he's a cisgender man who is straight. And so the fact that this is not true, but I'm just saying this as an example. If he doesn't make as much money as me, or if he doesn't succeed in all these ways that I do, then he just didn't do enough, right? So I continue to affirm supremacist models of success with that narrative that is given to me as an adult, and perhaps can apply that to other people that I meet in my organization or that I'm coworkers with, colleagues with, based on my personal experience rather than a larger analysis. Organizationally, what that looks like is that I might have access to some resources, more resources than other people, for all of the reasons that I named before. Hardworking, Ivy League, higher education, right? All of those reasons might make me someone who has influence in these organizations. And I have been in those positions where I've granted, in some cases, very, positions of power that give me money to give to other people, or that give me influence with other people who do have money. And so even if I'm not at the top of the ranks per se, I'm often sought out for different troubleshooting ideas. Well, we have this community issue that's coming up. Can I get your 2 cents on it, right? If I continue to play that role without challenging it, without thinking about who else should be in that conversation, who should be in the room, then I continue to affirm that I am an acceptable voice for all POC issues, that I'm acceptable because of my experience. And and that there is a right and wrong way to be POC, rather than actually challenging the notion that I am a go-to person for this, when there is actually a ton of other people who are going to be more impacted by these decisions based on different marginalized experiences. Some perhaps people who, don't have higher education, who have not been deemed employable. So this is how that personal lens, that personal influence can impact the positions that I hold institutionally, and why I can contribute further to institutional disadvantage for folks who are also in positions of marginalization, who are Black, Indigenous, people of color. Okay, moving us on. We're gonna ask folks, you all, to take a breath and perhaps think about for yourselves, what resources does your privilege give you access to personally? So not organizationally, but this could be personally within your organization, like the example that I shared of people seeking advice from me at the work level, right? Or it could be personally, just in your personal, it doesn't have to be work related. No college debt, a seat at the table, opportunity, money, higher salary, connections, computer skills, access to white people. Stable income. I think I saw confidence and safety pop up before they went away, and I wanted to lift those up. Big ones we're seeing: access, education, money, opportunity. Fantastic. Over 200 folks weighing in. Just want to name, if folks haven't looked at this little bottom corner here. It's a good group of folks who are with us. Thanks. As we move forward with this, I know that there have been questions to clarify intersectionality. So I'm going to leave space for people to keep on answering on the Mentimeter. And I'm also going to ask Pavitamu to step in.
Okay, so thank you folks for asking that question, to have intersectionality, to just restate that so folks can hear it. So when you think about intersectionality, one of the easiest ways to think about it is that for any individual person, there are multiple things that make up our identities. All of us earlier shared some of our identities, some of who we are and what brings us to the table. And so when we're thinking about systemic racism in particular, we're thinking about intersectionality in this way. So my experience as someone who is Black is going to be informed by a couple different things, by many different things, right? So it's going to be informed by my age. It's going to be informed by the environment that I grew up in. It's going to be informed by the environments that I'm in now, whether those are the same or different than environments that I grew up in. It's going to be informed by the reality of being a parent to a Black child. All of these different things are part of who makes me me, what makes me me, and inform how I experience racism or anti-Blackness as a person, right? So the way that I experience anti-Blackness has been very gendered. As a person who grew up as a girl, as a person who is non-binary now, I cannot unlink my experience of gender and my experience of Blackness. Those two things are tightly interwoven. So if you ask me to talk about what it means to be a Black person, what it means, how the ways that I've experienced anti-Blackness, it is always going to be interwoven with the way that I have experienced gender. Those are important intersections of my identity. So when you talk about intersectionality, what we're talking about is a recognition of and a reckoning with the reality that there's not a monolithic Blackness, there's not a monolithic whiteness, there's not a monolithic any of the ways that we experience racialization, that it's always going to be informed by these other things that are sometimes really salient parts of our identity and sometimes less salient parts of our identity, but that we live at the intersections of these various identities, and those intersections inform how we experience racism.
All right. Let's go on to the institutional example. I'll stop sharing. Okay. So I walked us through, I tried to be quick, but I probably wasn't. I tried to walk us through a personal example of how awareness building can get us to this other place of trying to understand what are the ways that I show up that can either take away access from other people or invite access, invite openings to further explore a more inclusive, a more affirming, a more equitable space, right? At the institutional level, we have the same awareness building need. The awareness to say what access has my institution had historically or currently that perhaps other folks, other institutions, other nonprofits have not had. So we're going to look you can have a lot of answers to that. We're going to look very specifically as an example to relationship with foundations or corporate funders, right? So what this could look like for you is if you're an organization who has historically been privileged, perhaps because of who was in your leadership before, who founded the organization, perhaps majority white folks or white men as a founding ED, right? And that has given you, and over time with relationships has given you some grounding in the game. So there's some force that says, we've been here, we've been in it, and we are this formidable nonprofit organization, right? What does that mean when it comes to relationships to foundations? There's probably some privilege embedded there. There's maybe perhaps sometimes an invitation to closed grants. So, there's somebody who has some money that they're trying to give out, and they want you to be the one that carries out the vision for that money. Or they want you to be at least the one that applies to it. This invite is not going to go public. Or perhaps it's going to go public in a month, but you know about it beforehand. So you're going to have some prep time as an organization. This might be also applied to being thought of for visibility opportunities, like, I had one, it's here, like for conferences or other types of networking options where they say, you know what, we know a good nonprofit who can serve as that role of mentoring your corporate group, who might later lead into, a bigger grant or bigger donations. So we're going to put you there rather than do a full sweep of who in the community could benefit from this position or this opportunity, this visibility opportunity. It can also look like direct contact with program officers. Maybe you've had a program officer for a while, you worked with them on a different grant, and something is coming up and you want to give them a call about the question. Or, someone in the organization at least has the power to do that, to get more information, something that an institution that is new or that has no connections to the foundation or corporate sponsor would never do, right? Would not pick up a phone call, would not pick up the phone or ask someone else to pick up the phone on their behalf to answer any questions about an opportunity. It could also look like extension of deadlines, perhaps, right? So just thinking about what are all of the ways that the relationship, not just the knowing that not knowing that the foundation exists, but the relationship that my organization has developed with these funders give me access to things that other organizations do not. And is that fair and equitable? Is that warranted? Where does that come from? Again, we're going to pause and we're going to get your insight here. We want to know what, like we did with the personal examples of privilege, we want to know how your organization has historically been given access based on the identities of your leadership or based on shared histories that folks might have, right? I'm going to move our slide on the Mentimeter so you can actually answer this question. Funded leadership development. It's a good one. Faith-based support. Visibility, publicity. Should I roll? Oh, here we go. well-connected board members, corporate connections, finance industry, access to government, friendship networks, political capital, powerful board, powerful CEO and founder. Visibility. Staff have left our organization and gone to work at foundations. Very good. Money expertise. Special invites. Halo effect. Oh yes, multi-year funding. That looks like trust, right? Folks trust that you know what to do with a lot of money for a long time. Fantastic. Thank you all so much. We're going to move from here, but I'm going to invite you to keep on inputting things as they come to you. This question is open. You can, when we go forward on questions, you'll go forward, but you can also come back. With that, I'm going to give it to Pavi Tamu to talk a little bit more about how we can move from this place that you all are naming to really thinking about accessing community need and accessing the need that's available, that is there within your own organization.
So one of the things that's really important, right, about the awareness piece is coming to understand what resources are available to you, so that you are then thinking about how can I start to offer up or shift or move those resources in my efforts to create better equity, right? So it's not just I know what they are now, it's in them, what am I going to do with them? And when we start to think about the question of what am I going to do with them, what really needs to be centered in that question is not, what do you think is the best thing to do with those resources because they're coming from your privileged identities, but it's what are the needs of folks who are directly impacted by racism, right? What are those needs and how have they been identified? So how can I educate myself to better understand and know what those needs are, so that when I am thinking about and when I am making plans to shift and move resources, I'm doing them in alignment with what BIPOC folks in my community, in my organization, have identified as their needs. So I want to, there are so many resources that exist for us to tap into and to access and learn from. And there are ways that we can create spaces ourselves where we can learn from folks who are in direct community with us. So I talked a little bit earlier about the exit interview as an opportunity to learn about the experiences of BIPOC folks who are leaving your organization, and to take those learnings and move them into something actionable to shift the way that folks are experiencing your organization, right? So that's a version of what it looks like to educate ourselves, right? There are also tons and tons and tons of existing resources. And I want to lift this up in particular because one of the things that we want to make sure folks are clear on is to not put yourself or your institution in a place where it is you are consistently putting the onus of labor onto folks who are marginalized to explain to you all the time what they need, to that folks have done this work and have contributed in these ways, that you can access those. So there are tons of resources available, and really being strategic about how you're taking advantage of those can be important, and also lift the onus of labor from BIPOC folks to educate you off of their shoulders, right? So the onus is not on the folks who are experiencing that weight. And if there is need for more direct conversation and learning that you're being like thoughtful about what will it take, what's helpful for you to be able to be in this conversation with me, what's supportive of you, what supports you to be able to share with me, right? Whether that's financial resources, whether that's this is paid time for the person, whatever that looks like, to be creative about that, please. So I want to make sure that folks also we talked a little bit about white dominant culture, and I just want to make sure that we're on the same page around what that means as we continue to be in conversation. So when we talk about white dominant culture, we're really talking about the idea or ideology that the thoughts, beliefs, actions of white people are superior to or better than the thoughts, beliefs, and actions of Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And the way that white dominant culture shows up is multifaceted. So it can show up interpersonally, it can show up intrapersonally. So how, like that piece about like, how am I thinking? How am I feeling? It can show up institutionally or structurally, like in our systems, right? So it's in the same way that culture itself proliferates, this culture proliferates in all of those different ways. So as we're thinking about education, I just want folks to start to get a sense of what you already know and where you might have possibilities to learn more. So we're going to do another question in Minty. So let's get a sense of how aware are you of the tangible day-to-day needs for Black, Indigenous, or people of color who are in your constituency, who are part of the communities that you serve? Give folks a chance to respond to that. And then follow-up question with this one is, when you think about the folks who, Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are part of your organization, how aware are you of their tangible and day-to-day needs? So I'll stop share here, Crystals, if you can pop up. So thanks, folks, for taking a minute to respond here. We're seeing similar numbers right now on folks feeling sort of in this middling place, right, around their awareness of the tangible day-to-day needs of constituents, as well as the tangible day-to-day needs of BIPOC folks. So as you're self-assessing and getting an understanding for you and your organization, this is a way that you can start to zoom in. Where do I need to expend more time, more energy to learn, right? Do I need to work more deeply do I need to do more deep work with my constituency, with BIPOC folks in my constituency, to better understand what those day-to-day needs are? What might that look like for me? What resources already exist that I can tap into? What partnerships might I have where folks might be closer or better understand our shared constituencies, those types of things, and how can I learn through there, and what tables or spaces might I want to create to help expand the way that I understand the needs, so that I can move the resources that we have to addressing those. And then also, what are my opportunities for learning more about what people internal to my organization are needing. So again, depending on where you are, this can help you assess like where you might want to put more resources at the onset, and where so what you might want to prioritize, whether it's your constituency, whether it's folks internal to your organization, knowing that you eventually want to get to both, but where should you start, right? Where could you start? Okay, I'm gonna shift back. So as we start to think about what it looks like to do our education work, one of the big things is once we're learning, then what are we doing about what are we doing with what we're learning? So I'm going to share a clip. I just want folks to listen, and then we'll have I'll follow up. We'll have a little bit more from this.
Happy Thanksgiving, America. I'm Donna, and I'm here with my friends to tell you the real history behind this holiday. Growing up, I knew that what they told you in school about Thanksgiving wasn't true. That's not the true story. The true story behind Thanksgiving was, after every killing of a whole village, these European settlers celebrated it, and they called it Thanksgiving. But it wasn't until Abraham Lincoln became president that it became an official holiday.
He ordered 38 Dakota men to be hung for war crimes.
After the sacred holiday Christmas.
We take this time to remember our elders who lost their lives due to what really happened. Usually my mom makes a Native American dish for us and we pray.
Growing up, I would be kind of annoyed that they didn't know what actually happened on Thanksgiving and that they're actually celebrating the deaths of many people and many tribes that were lost.
Whether it's to give thanks or to be with your family, you should learn how the holiday was established in the first place.
I'm thankful for being born indigenous to this continent.
I'm thankful that I still have my culture.
I'm thankful that my elders kept our culture alive all these years.
I'm thankful to be indigenous, resilient, and alive.
I'm thankful for us all to be able to stand together, stand strong, and stand as one.
Happy Thanksgiving, America.
Okay, so having a better understanding from Indigenous people about their experience of Thanksgiving and their relationship to Thanksgiving can and should shift the way that you as an individual and as an organization relate to that holiday, right? And so one of the things you might do is then start to think about what are the resources that my institution or organization has moved to support like this holiday that has been harmful or not been, that has been harmful and has erased the experience of Indigenous folks. And one of the things that folks resources they've often moved is the time, employee time and associated money, so the paid time off that folks get around this time. So how can you shift your PTO practices to be more equitable and more inclusive, knowing the impact of this day for Indigenous communities? So really, as we're elevating histories and that have shaped particular norms, we should be thinking, or as we're elevating different histories to reshape what our norms are, we can be thinking about what else can we do to move away from the normalizing of the narrative of Thanksgiving as this way that pilgrims and Indigenous folks came together that's not based in the reality or the experiences of Indigenous folks. And so when you think about how you do time off around that time, can you actually change your PTO policy and procedure so that folks can choose how and when they take time off? Do you want to continue to have your offices closed on Thanksgiving? Do you want to change your framework around taking that time off? Do you want to call that a different day? Do you want to take that time off for a different reason as an organization if you do want to do that? So just like really starting to think about, given what I learned from communities who are directly impacted, how do I shift my policies and procedures to better align with the experiences and truths of those people, right? So I'll stop there and pass it to Crystal to talk a little bit about. Let me leave you all with a question to really think about. So as you are thinking about, just continue to think about your resources and how you're actually shifting them in service of the story that we heard from these Indigenous young women. And then I will pass it to Crystal.
Okay, so to have this conversation, one of the tools that we talk about that is required if you're going to engage either your constituents or folks that are in your organization is what it means to create the space, the bravery for people to come out to actually say these things, right? If you are in even affirming institution, this could be really challenging, particularly if you're in an affirming institution and this is the first time a BIPOC employee has been in an affirming institution and it feels like, I know this isn't fantastic, but it's the best that I've ever worked at, right? So I don't want to put something on the line or put myself in a situation that's going to make me vulnerable to backlash or being seen as ungrateful or all these other feelings that can come up at different levels of the organization if you are a person of color that has received any benefit, either by employment or through constituency and service receiving, right? So thinking about how do we invite voices that actually engage bravery and engage courage is important. It moves us away from this idea of, Pavitami, if you could move forward. It moves us away from this idea of a safe space, acknowledging that safety is very important. And also, in order for things to change and move forward, there's risk that Pavitami would talk about earlier and courage that's required. So in order to be visible, really visible, we are vulnerable. We take both these quotes from Audre Lorde and Brene Brown that remind us that that vulnerability, the space for us to be there is strong, requires courage. And if we're going to seek it out from folks, then we have to make sure that there are things that we've put in place to make sure that those folks are not going to be further harmed, and that it's not just BIPOC voices that we're asking to engage in safety, engage in bravery and courage. It's also white voices, right? It's also folks who have benefited from lots of privileges that need to be able to engage courageously without knowing what the outcome is, without being able to control the situation and say, this is worthwhile because the process is worthwhile, even if I can't control people, what people share, how I feel about it, any of those things, right? So this is the engagement of brave space. If you can go forward, Pavitami. The first thing it requires for us to get there is to embrace difference. Pavitami noted this earlier. BIPOC experiences are not monolithic, right? Intersectionality tells us folks' experiences will be different depending on different identities, different experiences that they've had in their life. Folks who have shared identity do not have shared experience or don't necessarily even relate to that shared experience in the same way if they do have a shared experience. So this could move over into or could carry over into even the way that BIPOC folks or constituents want to engage in this conversation. There are folks who, if I have been a person of color in a nonprofit organization for 20 years, and I have moved from being in a tokenizing institution or a club institution to an affirming institution, I might say, you know what, that's my boundary. This is my work. And I'm not going to give more of my time, my input, my energy to this conversation about how to move our organization forward. And that is okay, right? That is that person's boundary informed by their experience. That you might have another person who is willing to put in time to have this conversation. And it's important to note that those two positions, those two approaches are equally valid, equally valuable, equally important when we're talking about creating brave spaces that people want to engage in. Can you move forward? Also, you got to own your impact, right? We can't expect to have this conversation with constituents, with people of color without acknowledging any history that might have been there before. So have you done a diversity training before and it landed flat on its face? It hurt some people and you haven't talked about it since then, right? Or was there a mass exodus of people of color or a person of color of influence who left the organization and no one has talked about it since? It was mysterious. Or was there a community conflict that happened between your organization and another organization and we just haven't spoken about it? It's been in a zone of silence. These are all things that you will have to own in order to create a brave space, because those narratives, those stories, the people who were there to see that, to bear witness, to be a part of it, they remember, right? The way that they show up is informed by those experiences that have perhaps been ignored. And even if you're on the other end of it, even if you're trying to make good, without acknowledging the baggage that your organization might have, you won't be able to get to moving forward, because that narrative is always there, right? It's not a transitioning, it's not transforming. So it's important to own anything that has happened. And this could happen too, even in positions that are not white dominant, right? At a community level, if you have two organizations, one that is led by Latinx folks, that serves primarily the Latino community, and one that is led by Black folks that serves historically Black communities. And this can happen, I live in South LA, right? Is there a tension there? Have these communities spoken to each other? Does one organization get privileged over another? Or is there a history of that happening, whether by choice or just by, it happens to happen this way? Well, how have you engaged in those conversations meaningfully from institution to institution or community to community? If that hasn't happened, if it's mostly ignored, this is not to say that I have no one in mind, right? This is just, perhaps this is a potential scenario. If we can't own that impact that has had on the community, then making this space for brave space is going to be very difficult. And the acknowledgement that directly impacted people need to be in the room, need to be in the conversation, need to be in decision-making powers, positions. If they are not, then the changes that you're proposing will impact them. They will be on the menu, right? They will be the folks who are experiencing your changes, not the people who are informing your changes. So this looks like, say you have a youth council and you're making decisions based on your youth serving organization. You are making decisions that are going to inform the services that go out to young people. And you have a youth council and you've already made a decision and you want to run it by the youth council to see what they think, right? That is not being at the table. You have already made the decision. You have already started to think about the idea, started to think about the solution, and are looking to check with them if it's okay. That's different than having the youth council be in the room with you when you're describing the problem, describing where you want to go, being able to be there before the decision gets made, right? And really inform and have value and perspective onto how the whole organization is functioning, or how the desire to provide this service is being met or not just for the explicit purpose of whatever it is that you're trying to change or alter. So we have a short amount of time, so I'm gonna stop there and give it to Pavitiamu for taking risks, and we can circle back if we need to.
Thanks, Crystal. So I just want to acknowledge there are some great things coming up in the questions, and we hope that we'll have time to get to a couple of them. And Crystal kind of spoke to someone's question right now around what does it mean can you have all white leadership and still be an equitable organization? So just remember that if you're not on the menu, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu slide when the person who asked that question, please. So when we talk about taking risk as an organization, this is kind of the culminating action, if you will, from the rest. So once we have an understanding and awareness of our resources, once we understand or have a better understanding of what the community's needs are through doing the education piece, and once we've established culture and norms that allow for a brave space, then we're well positioned to be able to take these risks in a way that advances equity. So when we say taking risks, we do mean we're putting our privilege and power on the line. You're leveraging your privilege or your power to shift and advance equity. So that can begin with embracing cultural shifts that create more space for BIPOC leadership, shifting resources at your organization in a way that creates parity at least, but really thinking about equity. And then also leveraging your institutional resources to advance equity. And this oftentimes can look like having to share and having to speak up in a way that feels uncomfortable, that feels hard, because it means having tough conversations with other leaders at your organization. It means having tough conversations with your funders. It means having tough conversations with your board. And it means engaging in hard conversations with your constituency and folks who have experienced marginalization at your board. So marginalization within your organization. So really remembering that, like, to take these risks, we do have to speak up in those moments when we're most challenged, right? Or we're feeling really, it feels hard to do. And I want to acknowledge that every organization has a unique culture and has taken its own approach to creating structures that support that culture at the organization. And all of our organizations exist within the broader white dominant culture. And so all of our organizations are consistently going to be combating bringing in and normalizing the things that come from white dominant culture in our own internal organizations, cultures, and structures. Learning really how BIPOC folks have been impacted by your culture and structure will help to create priorities for shifting. So I saw someone asked in the questions, the exit interviews are a great idea, but what about BIPOC folks who are still in the organization? How are we learning from folks who are still around the table? So thank you for asking that question. And there are different ways. So one of the ways might be to figure out how you all are cultivating and normalizing, creating brave spaces where folks are so open and able to share authentically and honestly. And the other ways might be like ensuring that you're doing something in an ongoing way that allows for feedback and input from folks that might not, where they might not feel able to share. So you could be doing kind of more inclusion and equity surveys at your organization every 6 months, at least once a year, that sort of thing. So you're getting an understanding from folks around what has impacted them. One of the things that comes up often in our work is people feeling like they are, especially BIPOC folks, feeling like they are undervalued. And they experience this in lots of different ways, but one of the ways that is most salient is in how people are compensated and how people's compensation in the organization aligns with compensation problems that are institutionalized across the country and in particular in the nonprofit sector. So I want to just talk through an example of how folks might experience this. And I'm actually gonna, I think, stop screen sharing as I talk this through. So the problem that might have come up or might be named, you might have Black women who are part of your organization who have articulated that a lack of transparency around compensation has negatively impacted them. So that's the problem. That's the thing that you want to address. What you want to understand is then what are the cultural pieces and what are the structural pieces that are helping to influence that. And so different states, I know in the state of California, it's illegal for your employer to say that you can't talk about your compensation. That doesn't mean that the culture in your organization hasn't normalized not talking about compensation, right? So culturally, you might have normalized not discussing pay and have discouraged the conversations from happening between employees. And then, so that might be happening in your organization, just like a little bit of a hush-hushness or a little bit of like whispering about it or things like that. And then alongside of that, some of the structural norms that might exist that support that culture are that you don't post pay ranges in your job postings. And like, as you all are making pay and compensation decisions, you have disparities in how you are paying people based on hyper valuing of specific types of education. So an Ivy League education or an education from in California. In California, our UC systems are seen as more prestigious than our Cal State systems. They're both public universities in California, so we might be prioritizing or extending higher pay offers to folks who come from the UC compared to the Cal State systems, things like that, right? And or you might be doing things where you're prioritizing certain types of work experience over others and not seeing the connection, like, or not seeing that different types of work experiences are applicable. So it might be that if you're an advocacy organization, you're seeing that someone who has worked at an institution that you partner with and trust or whatnot for 3 or 4 years as a lead organizer, their work is more valued. Their work experience is more valued than someone who is coming to your institution and has named organizing at their local church as their organizing experience, right? Even though the same amount of time and years and some transferable skills are involved in both of those, right? So just like thinking about those things, the way that your structural norms and what you have prioritized is helping to have the compensation disparities. So then when you think about those structural and cultural pieces, both of those things are coming together, right, in your organization to put an onus on Black women then to discover kind of that they're being paid less. So that's the emotional like toll and impact. So I have to kind of figure out, I have to kind of whisper, I have to kind of hear from other folks in all these different ways. So I'm like learning this, and there's that piece that is part of my experience around feeling devalued in the organization. There are also these other parts of the experience around reinforcing wealth gaps between Black women and their white counterparts. And then continuing, you're also limiting the way that your organization is able to be accountable and limiting opportunities for your employees to create like collective or shared power amongst themselves through, right, these structural practices and these cultural norms. So just thinking about like really starting to understand that these priorities, you need to understand what pieces of your culture are supporting the impacts that people are experiencing and what pieces of your structure are supporting them. And then how do you dismantle those? How do you interrupt those? And so an example, again, just continuing with this example, it might mean taking risk might mean that you as an organization, like take apart your compensation, your approach to compensation and your compensation strategy, because you are prioritizing advancing equity and thinking about how you are shifting resources and power in alignment with that, right? So it means that your institution might not look or feel the same any longer, and that might feel hard for you. And it's the reality of what it means to do work in a way that is equitable. It also is putting you in a practice of not being an ally in name only, but like actively being in solidarity through kind of being an accomplice, right? You're working with BIPOC folks to create these changes that are needed in the organization. So compensation strategy wise, this might look like shifting pay from certain types of work, so your leadership level positions that might be higher paid, to create more equity. So if you are, these are just examples, right? But like if you are a majority white-led organization whose frontline staff is predominantly BIPOC, and there's huge compensation gaps between your frontline staff and your white leadership, how do you actually create a different pay structure that decreases the pay gap between those folks, right? Does it mean creating a pay tier where the ranges of pay are much smaller than what they might be right now, so that pay equity is happening across the organization? Those are the types of things that you can think about. You also can think about how do you utilize PTO, flex days, all of these different things to allow more spaciousness for folks who might be frontline. So do you actually create something where frontline staff also get to take sabbaticals? Frontline staff are given more PTO or a 36-hour work week instead of a 40-hour work week. Those types of things to really, again, think about how are we shifting resources to create more equity and more and more access given what we have around the table. So encouraging folks to be creative as you think about these things. And we're gonna wind down with the last Mentimeter.
We're going to wind down. Actually, do you want to wind down with the Mentimeter?
Should we? What do you want to do?
Do you want to, because we have 1 minute, no? Am I wrong?
Yeah.
Okay, I think we should, so we should go, I think maybe into resources, or at least provide some information on next steps, because I see a lot of questions in the chat. And so we won't be able to address them here in this space, but perhaps afterwards we can group some of these together and provide some resources that speak to some of the questions that are coming up here. I know that June shared at the beginning that after this, you'll get a recording of this session, but we'll also, given our conversation today, given the questions that you've asked and some of the things that we saw come through the Mentimeter, we will compile resources that we feel like speak to some of the things that have been brought to the table, so that folks have proper guidance moving forward. It might not be exactly your specific guidance, but we hope that we can get some generalized feels that give people some place to land as next steps. I'm going to move the Mentimeter for this next question as a reflection question, and folks feel free to, if you have an additional moment, answer this question that you'll see pop up in your Mentimeter if you're there. It's how can we create brave spaces at our institutions that are structurally supported, right? So that this answers a lot of the question about folks asking, how do you not put the onus on people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, but how do we structurally support ongoing feedback that isn't like, something happened, so let me run to you, Pavitamu, and tell me everything that you've experienced, right? But that acknowledges that a lot of what you all named in the Q&A is that this is a continuum experience and doesn't require lots of input at one moment, but actually is the art of receiving input ongoing over a long period of time. So how do we structurally support that input so that we can be getting it and responding and being changing, transforming over time? Not tomorrow, not so we can report it next week, but so we can make impact in the long run. Thank you all so much. Pavitamu, do you want to say anything before we exit?
Just a lot of appreciation and thanks. And again, Crystal and I are going to look at the resources. We had things that we wanted to share with you all, but we're going to look at your questions to refine what we shared to help address some of the things we weren't able to get to. So thank you again so much.
Thank you both so much. This is incredibly rich, and you could tell by the questions that people were engaging very deeply with you and with themselves, with each other, even as they tried to process the content. And this whole issue of data collection, like wanting to understand, but also being really cautious about gathering information. I think that's a big theme here and something to work through. So I really appreciate your offer to put some targeted resources in the follow-up email. Folks, you can expect that email Monday or Tuesday next week, probably. We'll have the recording, whatever works for the two of you in terms of putting together just some light resources, and we'll include that with the follow-up email. And right now, you can also provide some feedback with the evaluation. Thank you both so much for this wonderful session.